Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Let's go out to Davos again. Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait is sitting down with Argentina's president, Javier Milei. Let's listen in.
Let's begin with the big news of the week. You are, I think, you are perhaps the only world leader here at the moment who is in Davos, but also went to the inauguration in Washington. And I wonder, America was celebrating. Should the world celebrate the arrival of President Trump?
Definitely, the world should celebrate the arrival of President Trump. His speech was clear and decisive, and that golden era he proposes for the United States will shine a light for the whole world, as it will spell the end of the woke ideology that is doing so much damage to the world.
One thing, though, just to push you a little bit, you have always been a free trader. You're a great fan of Margaret Thatcher and Milton Friedman. But President Trump is coming and he is bringing tariffs, he's bringing protectionism. I wondered, how can a disciple of Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher like that kind of economics?
First of all, I am in no position to give an opinion on another country's trade policy. I think it would be irresponsible and disrespectful towards any country. On the other hand, I think that unlike other leaders, Trump understands very well geopolitics and uses the US trade geopolitics as part of the broader geopolitics. It's not that he is protectionist, rather he knows what the role of the US in the world is, and therefore his trade policy is a part of his geopolitical strategy. It is a geopolitical tool, that's the point. So if you fail to understand the playing field that Trump is playing on, it'll be hard to understand his vision. But certainly the guidelines he is putting forward will bring a much better world, no doubt.
Did you discuss a free trade agreement with Argentina, with President Trump or his advisors?
We are working very hard on the possibility of entering into a free trade agreement, and in fact, when I recently took over as pro tempore president of Mercosur, I pointed out that Mercosur should move forward on three fronts. One related to the fight against terrorism, drug trafficking, and that is also easy to move forward on, bringing down the common external tariff, but also being able to make progress independently. In other words, that each of our countries should have independence to be able to work on trade agreements, because clearly Argentina has decided to become integrated into the rest of the world. It wants to go back to its golden era in history, where it was an important world player. And for that, we need to move forward on free trade agreements. We need to open up the economy, and Mercosur can't become an obstacle to that. Therefore, while we work with the US government to move towards a free trade agreement, we also work indoors within Mercosur so that it won't be an obstacle to move towards free trade. So we're working very hard on that.
Would you leave, very quickly, would you leave Mercosur to do a free trade agreement with America?
Well, if the extreme condition were that, yes. However, there are mechanisms that can be used even being within Mercosur. So we think that it can be done without necessarily having to leave Mercosur as such. And it's also worth noting this, because often when comments on the negative consequences of leaving Mercosur, reference is made to the automotive industry. But the automotive industry has an agreement outside the framework of Mercosur, so that is a false argument. So we are exploring ways for Argentina to be able to open up to international trade. And why? Because the division of labor brings prosperity. Adam Smith said so. And 250 years later, Dad holds true. Adam Smith is still right.
I'm always pro Adam Smith. Since we came and saw you in April last year, and I checked, you have actually done very well. I will pay you tribute. When I arrived last year, Argentina's inflation was more than 10% a month. Now you brought it down below 3%. Sovereign bonds were 50 cents. Now they're trading at 70. The economy is no longer in recession. You've done a lot by any measure, and that's one reason why people clap you so fiercely. But, there are more challenges ahead, and one big one is capital controls. I know that you want to lift them, but can you tell me when you will do that?
Well, if you will allow me, a little correction on the figures. First, retail inflation is now even below 3%, and we have a crawling peg scheme which includes a 2.5% limit, and since for 3 months we've been in line with the crawling peg, we've decided to bring it down to 1%. So induced inflation in Argentina now, consumer inflation, will go from 2.5%, our aim now being 1.5%. And the inflation that matters is wholesale inflation. That's what counts, because it's not contaminated by tariff effects, and it's the one on utility rate effects. When we took office, it was 54%, which is 17,000% annualized, and the latest wholesale inflation data pointed to 0.8%. So on the wholesale front, for several months now, we have had deflation in dollars. And regarding economic activity, the third quarter, which is the one for which we have the latest GDP data, the figure was 3.9%. So if you annualize that, Argentina is expanded at 17% annually. And if you take the floor in the economy in April, when it bottomed out, we could be talking about 10 or 11% expansion annually. And let me say this, which is very important. We have just really done away with all economic theory handbooks. Generally, it is said that during a recession, you need to pursue expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. However, in our case, amidst the recession, and besides we really had the components of the worst crises in Argentina's history. We had monetary imbalances similar to those in the time of the Rodrigazo crisis. We also had central bank account imbalances even worse than prior to the 1989 hyperinflation under President Alfonsín. We had social indicators that were even worse than those just before the convertibility program. And when you look at other cases in which these large-scale adjustments need to be made, our fiscal adjustment was 15% of GDP. So 10 and 5, central bank and treasury. And when you look at other experiences, normally GDP tends to fall about 15% in such circumstances. And the way the figures stand, the year should be closing with a 2% fall. But the interesting thing is that the statistical drag was 2.8% as far as the fall is concerned. So the economy is better off than what we received, and so much so that when you look at the deseasonalized series for the monthly economic activity indicator, November is already above the level when we took office. And why? Because, you see, the interesting thing is we made the largest fiscal adjustment in history, and during a recession we lowered inflation from 54 to 0.8%, and in dollar terms we have a deflation. But at the same time the economy has expanded. And we inherited monthly poverty of 57%, and now it would be 36%, so we brought it down by 21 percentage points. This means that we have lifted some 10 million Argentines out of poverty.
You have done a great job, and that's what I said, and you have now said at even greater length that you have done a great job. But there was a question. You said in December you will eliminate capital controls sometime this year. I wondered, can you be more specific? Will it be the first half of this year or the second half?
We are committed to lifting the currency controls and capital controls. We are committed to that because we believe that the controls are an expropriation tool on the part of the public sector. Past governments abused the money printing and generated inflation, and people wanted to switch portfolios to protect themselves, and the controls were introduced in order to artificially create more demand for pesos, and this increased and expanded the base of the inflationary tax, which was really cheating people out of the money. So these controls not only restrain freedom but go against property rights, and as a libertarian I respect the right to life and property, and of course I'm going to do away with it, but I'm a libertarian liberal. I'm not just a silly liberal. I'm not going to actually deviate from that, because it's about flows and stocks. You see, we have found that we need to define the conditions to remove the controls. One of them is that induced inflation should converge vis-a-vis observed inflation. So now we are moving on to a crawling peg of 1%. What will happen after 3 months if the figure of inflation is 1.5%? This means that we would be converging in terms of inflation, and we would have to do away with the crawling peg. And another thing we have set as a condition is that the observed monetary base should coincide with the broad base, so that we will be sure that the money overhang generated by currency controls will go away, and when we open up and lift the controls, there will be no run. And the third point has to do with the possibility of getting finance. But why is financing important? Because this brings forward in time the end of the currency controls. We will be doing away with the controls at a point when we again rebuild the stock balance in the central bank. The difference is that if we secure the financing, the exit will be faster. This is also very important. Any kind of agreement we may enter into with the IMF, with investment funds, and or with investment funds, means funds coming into the Treasury's coffers that will be used not to finance the Treasury, because the Treasury is in a fiscal balance position. It will be used to repurchase debt as far as the central bank is concerned, which is, by the way, the Treasury's largest creditor. And this has several effects. The total debt does not increase. It's just the composition of it that changes. But you rebuild the central bank balance sheets, and the more solvent the central bank is, the balance price level is lower, and if you take the current price level and the long term, the slope gives you inflation. When you rebuild the central bank balance sheets, you also bring down long-term inflation. So what you're going to do, if we secure the financing, is ensure that this is a lot faster. Again, we're going to end the controls no matter what. The thing is the speed. The more financing we get, the sooner we'll get out.
It depends on the IMF. You have this, at this moment you are negotiating with the IMF. At the moment, Argentina has a $44 billion program. Are you trying to get an increase on that? Or would you be happy with just rolling over the 44 billion?
Part of it has to do with the structure of payments, and another
to push them further out.
Right. And another part has to do with getting fresh funds to rebuild the central bank accounts, the stocks, and thereby accelerate the lifting of the currency controls. That is not being discussed. It's definitely going to happen, but I can't consider lifting the controls if I don't know how much money we're talking about. And it's not just about how much, but about how. Because what I need to do is match the flows of funds. So the key is about that. This whole negotiation makes it clear that we are going to lift the controls, but the exit will depend in terms of the speed on the amount of the operation and on how the operation is structured. In other words, it's not the same if I get all of the money cash as opposed to in installments. What I need to match is a flow of funds.
On that specific, would you like more than 44 billion? Just yes or no?
Yes, of course.
That
would be fresh funds. Yes, right. But what matters here, what's important, is that the new fresh funds will not increase Argentina's total debt, because they will be used to pay off debt that is held by the central bank. The national treasury's largest creditor is the central bank, because Kirchner actually cheated Argentines by placing illiquid bonds in the central bank and took away the reserves. So what we are trying to do is rebuild the assets, replenish the assets of the central bank, so as to free up the stocks and pay off the dividend debts, for example. And, sorry, one more thing. We have made great progress towards lifting the controls. When we came into office, only 10% of imports was being paid, and now nearly 100% is being paid. So there has been enormous improvement, and there are still some fine details to
another
finalize
sort
this.
of creditor out there, another big investor is China. Historically, you were not a fan of China, I think it would be fair to say. But the Chinese government has lent Argentina's central bank more than $18 billion. Plenty of Chinese investment in Argentina. You said you were going to go to Beijing this month. Is that still going to happen?
We've had some very fruitful meetings with the Chinese embassy and with Xi Jinping, a meeting which we had in Brazil during the G20 summit. And we consider that our economies are complementary and that there's a lot for us to do together as great trade partners. So the flip side of the swaps has to do with the commercial situations. The idea is to deepen the trade relationship. In fact, we intend to pay a visit to China.
But are you a bit like President Trump? Do you appreciate China more now you are in office?
Well, sometimes you also need to learn.
Yes.
Don't you learn something new every day?
Yes, we always try. You have one particular thing. Will you go back to the international bond market?
Well, if I fail to learn, I will harm the Argentines, so have extra pressure to learn fast.
What about going back to the international bond markets? When do you think you will hope to do that? To go and raise money by yourself without the IMF, without talking to China? When do you think you would?
Well, if you take a look, when we won the election, country risk was about 3,000 basis points. When we took office, the market was starting to believe because country risk had gone down to 1,900. Recently, it had pierced the 600 basis points. Now it has bounced back. Obviously, profit taking is only natural. That should be no cause for concern, but we have a zero deficit fiscal rule on the financial line. So if you have zero deficit, you don't take on new debt. So the debt to GDP ratio is a decreasing one. Moreover, this is the first government during our most recent democratic period. This is the first government that has brought the debt down by $30 billion. In this past year. So Argentina has a position of solvency that is very powerful, and this is about zero deficit. At the same time, the impact this has on country risk and on the interest rate makes Argentina find a trend growth floor of 4.5%, which means that in 50 years' time, Argentina would have the same per capita GDP as the United States in 50 years' time, with the United States keeping the current rates. But you should also consider that the adjustment was made by bringing down public spending, not by raising taxes, because in fact we gave people back about 15 percentage points of GDP. And not just that. We have also undertaken the largest structural reform in the history of Argentina, which was 8 times larger in scale than that under President Milei, through an emergency decree and a comprehensive reform package bill. But every day, our wonderful, marvelous, genius deregulation minister, Federico Sturzenegger, does away with regulations, and about 4 every day. So we're on the way to certainly becoming the freest country in the world at some point.
You have your friend Elon Musk. He is trying to do the same thing in America.
Just hold on, because I didn't fully answer the previous question, and what you asked previously is very important. This means that the debt to GDP ratio profile in Argentina comes down a lot. So when we finally free the currency controls, we'll lift them, the risk rating agencies will greatly improve our ratings and will be able to go out to market very easily. Because it's not that we need debt in order to cover deficit. We would just be rolling over debt in a decreasing debt to GDP context. So that will happen easily. And that's why it's so important for us to go into 2026 without controls.
Government efficiency. You are famous for your chainsaw, for taking this axe, this chainsaw to Argentine government. In America, you have Elon Musk, your friend, is trying to do the same thing. What do you advise him?
And let me make another point. The owner of the chainsaw is another one of my brilliant ministers, Luis Toto Caputo. He's the one who undertook the cuts. And this is very important. It's not just
you can lend him to President Trump.
I need him in Argentina because I want to continue to bring down spending, to continue to lower taxes. But what I mean is this. This is important. I would also like to praise the great job done by my brilliant minister, Toto Caputo. It's not just about making the treasury adjustment amounting to 5% of GDP in a way that wasn't painful for the people. And we need to do it quickly. We started to bounce back as from April already. And if we didn't do the job in the central bank, we could have had hyperinflation. And that's also thanks to the work of Toto Caputo and Santiago Bausili, who heads the central bank, and also our finance secretary, Pablo Quirno. These things are very important. Sorry, I'm taking away some of your time going into these detailed answers, but they're very important. And clearly what you say is actually happening, because the IMF has actually invited our deregulation minister, Federico Sturzenegger, for him to share the experience of what we're doing in Argentina. And I will now make a point which is not minor. This is important to get the picture. When you look at the history of economic growth, the last 200 or 250 years of great, wonderful growth, this growth revolution we've had, thanks to which humans today live and are better off than emperors at any time in the past, this was due to the emergence of economic growth, the flip side of which is increasing returns, which in neoclassical economic theory are at loggerheads with the competitive model, the perfect competition model, which can't generate growth. Now, what is the problem? Increasing returns involve monopolies or concentrated structures. So when you look at a business and regulate it and want to make it look like some competitive company, what you're doing through regulations is to kill growth. And this is something that Kristalina Georgieva mentioned. She said, we see that total factor productivity is falling because of the situation regarding the regulations. This is why what Federico Sturzenegger and what Elon Musk is now doing in the United States, he's even in North Korea.
It is applicable in other places. I wonder, because in Europe we have all these people who are sitting there and who have barely shrunk government at all, who barely, do you regard them as kind of wimps? Are they people who have not taken on government in the same way as you have?
Well, next to me they're all wimps, right?
a familiar modesty.
Pero lo que digo es, sí, es que hay un problema de compatibilidad de incentivos.
There's an issue regarding the incompatibility of incentives, because I come from outside politics. I'm an outsider, and I believe in this kind of adjustment, it's politics that needs to lose out, and most of the politicians in Europe and in most of the world, the ones that only occupy a chair in Brussels, make a point of creating an environment to be better off themselves, not for people to be well off. And this is why they have introduced so many regulations, and this is why Europe is the part of the world that is growing the least. So we need to give power back to the people, to citizens. We need to break the fetters that enslave you to through regulations or through taxes. In fact, all regulations are absurd. So for as long as politicians are not willing to surrender their privileges, they will continue to kill growth. And you know what? I take the presidency as a job. I have a job description, which is to lower inflation, to reduce poverty, to end insecurity, and to make the economy grow. And you know what I'm going to do once I'm done? I'm going to deliver lectures.
You have midterm elections coming up, where all the things you've said will be on display. And your current approval ratings are quite high. But as you know, all the things you've talked about, there has also been pain for people in Argentina, as you've cut, as you've done things. What do you expect to happen in those midterms? Because if you don't get backing there for all this macho talk, you could be in trouble.
A ver,
Well, painful is what Argentina has gone through in the past 100 years. Having been one of the wealthiest countries, it has become a miserable country at the lower end of the spectrum. I think that is painful. I didn't create 57% poverty. I only inherited it. What I did was acknowledge the fact. I brought it down by 21 points in a year, and I adjusted the economy and politics, and still the economy expanded. So I didn't apply a painful recipe. I gave freedom back to the Argentines and improved the earnings. The average wages in the formal market went from $300 to $1,100. And given that the Argentine currency is no longer so depreciated, per capita GDP is 120% larger now, and the Argentines are way better off. This is why the approval ratings for our administration are around 60%. And if the election were today, we would get 50% of the vote. So there's broad consensus around our policies. People are getting it. The problem is not people. The problem is politicians who are losing out as part of this.
One last thing. Do you worry at all? You are a great student of economic reform in other places. Is that people can often have this huge push at the beginning. We saw this with people like Margaret Thatcher, maybe Ronald Reagan as well. But then after a bit, the momentum gets into trouble. What keeps you going at the speed you are going at the moment?
Well, what you've just asked is very important, because we look at politics on three fronts, on three lanes. One is management, administration as such. We've lowered inflation, the economy is growing, poverty has really come down tremendously, and insecurity is a thing of the past. So the administration is working. And what we have achieved in our administration is so important that our brilliant security minister went to the IMF to explain how we managed to maintain social order even amidst such a huge adjustment. The other track, and we've got the person in charge here, that's the political track. We are building our own political structure, and that's my sister's responsibility. And whereas many have tried to build their own parties and they've spent 5 or 10 years without being able to do so, my sister managed to do this in only 5 months. So congratulations, boss. And there's yet another element that is crucial, what we call the culture battle. Economic achievements do not suffice, nor do political achievements. If society, if the people fail to understand that the road to prosperity is about embracing the ideas of freedom, they may have an administration term or two,
and
but
how long
three,
does that take?
That will be lost.
To change the culture?
I wish I knew. What I do know is that I need to give it a try, and that's what we are actively working on too.
President Milei, thank you very much for talking to Bloomberg.
That was Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief John Micklethwait in conversation with Argentina's President Javier Milei.